Thank you guys for being here. It is a most beautiful winter afternoon here in Houston. I think the best we've had in many, many months. And you guys could be anywhere, but you decided to spend it with us. So thank you for that. That means a lot. My name is Renè Aninao. I am your moderator for this artist talk today. The reason that I am here is because next to the artist, I am probably the person in the world that knows more about these works than anyone, because I've had the privilege of living with them for many years. So we're going to have a little dialogue, maybe 30, 45 minutes. KRISTIN has some slides. We'll talk a little bit about background, process, how you got here, some of each of the works, and then also what that kind of means for the future. So housekeeping, super quick. This is like super informal.
Very, very informal.
I know we're recording it for history and all that, but I encourage you, if you have questions, ask questions, interject. If you want to get up, look at some of the works, happy to do that.
Actually, I encourage you to do that too, because I really, like when I'm making work, it's really so people can experience the work, not hear me talk about the work. So feel free, like it won't throw me, it'll actually make me really happy that you want to spend time with it. So feel free to walk around, be careful with some of the chords, but other than that, I hope that you really enjoy the work too, not just me yapping about the work.
There are also slides, paper copies right over there. If you're one of the first ones, there's some magazines, and feel free to take those with you that kind of give you some close-up detailed shots from our great photographer here, Mr. Paul Hester.
Side note on that, these are very draft slides, so there's not citations and stuff in there. And
but they're all taken by Paul.
If it was a good installation shot or a good photo of the work, it's from Paul. Thank you, Paul. And if it's bad or it's like a process shot, that was probably me.
There is also last housekeeping. There's water in the back, so feel free to take one too. So, okay, let's get started. So, my first question is always, how did you get here? And you know, you've taken a very, I say, winding and variable path to get here. And my own view is I kind of set your life into 4 different, what the girls nowadays call eras, right? The West Texas era, you have the Rice Houston era, you have the Stanford California era, and then you have the Parsons New York era. But all of those eras are embedded into these works at the still point, what me and her call ATSP for short. And all those experiences and eras are largely responsible, I think, for these works. So maybe you could start by talking a little bit about what are the key influences from each of those eras that are in ATSP, and let's start from the beginning, West Texas.
So I really liked the fact that Renè kind of gave these eras or these chunks, because I feel like my life has been this really winding path. And what I've tried to do with a few of these, through these eras, is maybe talk about a few of the things that I think impact the work that I make now. The first thing I think, and maybe the most important thing to understand about me, is I started dancing when I was 3 years old. And so my idea of space, my idea of movement, how you move through a space, comes from dance. And it's kind of been, it was my first love, it's still my love. If I'm stressed or anything, I just express myself, I play around with dance. The other thing you should know, that picture on top is actually the community theater from where I grew up. And my dad was the executive theater director of that community theater. And what that meant was that during the day, he was doing all these more administrative functions, you know, there was finance or fundraising, whatever. But in the evenings, he was either doing rehearsals or performances. And so my home was really at the theater. And even my dance studio was in the basement of that theater. So I was always at the theater, basically. I was a theater kid. And then the other thing I can tell you is that my mom was actually a potter before she had me. She made pottery. And so I was always, as a kid, making things. So we wouldn't go and like buy a dollhouse. We would make a dollhouse. Or I remember, you know, making all kinds of little books and pamphlets. And I have journals from back in the day when I would say, you know, I love my mom, I love my dad, I love my dog, and I paste things in. But it was always like very, very hands-on. And I think you can probably feel that from the work that's in here.
And dance is really about moving through space, right?
I think so.
And your body's relationship.
And your body's relationship to space. Absolutely.
So that brings us to the Rice era. You were a smart kid. And you know, tell us about the big part about Rice, which I think I kind of call it your wilderness era. Maybe wandering is a little bit more charitable, but tell us a little bit about that.
I think that's fair. So I actually went to Rice, had a liberal arts degree, so it was political science, economics. And I think at Rice teaches you a certain kind of way of thinking. It teaches you how to research something, how to analyze it, how to write, which I think is important in what I do now. One of the pivotal experiences for me, though, was the last semester where I studied abroad and I went to Spain. And that was when I really started getting into more visual art. So really in West Texas, it was more theater and dance. And then by the time I go abroad, when I'm in Spain, I really start seeing museums, going to more galleries, seeing the architecture of those spaces. And it was really interesting because when you study abroad and then you come home, you almost see the things in your home differently, or in your country. And that kind of took me to jobs that were very research-based, consulting. And during that time, any free time I had, I was traveling. So I backpacked through Central America, through South America, went over to Western Europe and spent like a month over there just traveling. And we're not talking luxury travel. This is like literal backpack, staying in hostels.
I don't do that.
Seeing as we call him a luxury guy. But no, this was like very just hands-on. Like I want to see as many things as I possibly can, right? And experience as much as I can.
You want to tell them the story about Picasso and the Louvre?
Oh, some of these museums, so the girl that you see with me in this photo on the, I guess, your left, my right, she and I would travel around all these incredible museums, and I would kind of act as the tour guide. And so I remember being in the Louvre one time and 2 other people came with us to this trip. And it was really funny because we'd been in there for apparently 3 hours. I felt it went by like really quickly. And they were like, it's time for lunch, Kristen, like we need to leave. And I really wanted to stay, and I just wanted to be with the work, And it was also, there was something interesting that happened when I saw Picasso for the first time, like in real life. It was different than seeing it in books. And so I think there was something that was developing in my mind about the experience of work versus just seeing an image of work. And also, being in Houston, you're seeing a lot of visual art. Rothko Chapel, I think, was a huge sanctuary spot for me, where I would go over and over again and really just take in that experience.
I always call that one in the back, that's against that wall right there,
Yeah,
is very Rothko.
I think there's some elements of Rothko in it, or even like the colors. I thought it was really fascinating, the colors that ended up coming out of that.
All right, so take us now to California, and Stanford is really about, I say, making arguments, because you like to make arguments. Yeah,
I think Stanford's a really kind of funny school, in that I remember when I had to sit for the bar exam. I sat for the bar exam here in Texas, and I remember cracking open the Barbie books and realizing I knew nothing about the actual law, because Stanford is really about teaching you, once again, how to think. It teaches you how to build arguments, and I think so much of my work is about that. It's thinking like, what are the core ideas that I'm really exploring and getting at, and how do you build that? How do you build that in an individual work? How do you build it in a series? How do you build it in a space? And so I think I really, I know for a lot of people, law school to artists is weird. To me, it makes perfect sense. And I'd also tell you, it gives you, I think, a certain discipline that I think I bring to the work that I do.
Maybe talk a little bit about what you started to feel was important. I mean, Stanford was a place where you really learned kind of how the world works, quite frankly, and what's important. And I know the Rodins were a big thing for you.
Yeah, so also being at Stanford, it was more and more visual art. Like, you have the Rodin sculpture garden out there. And so when you see something like Gates of Hell, or, you go down into San Francisco, or you go down to LACMA in LA, and I'm seeing all this kind of art, and that's having a huge impact on me too.
And then 2015.
2015,
I was pivotal year.
I was in Houston and was working in a law firm, and my grandmother had died. And so we went up to Chicago for the funeral. And while I was there, Charles Ray was giving his retrospective at the Art Institute of Chicago. And this show really had like a huge impact on me, and his idea of space and sculpture had a huge impact on me. And immediately after that, I'm from West Texas, and I went out to see Judd's work as an adult. And so I'm going to Shinati and Judd Foundation and seeing these, installations and the way he uses space and the way he's thinking about geometry, and that also had a huge impact on me at this point. And I think those were experiences that really made me think more about art and design, and that was kind of more where I wanted to pivot my life.
Did you think, well, we'll talk about that in a bit. Let's go to New York, Parsons. Really, it's about process there and sculpture for the body. I think you always used to tell me. But
Yeah, so I ended up quitting my job in the law, and I went to Parsons, moved up to New York, which is an incredible place to experience art. I mean, not only, theater, dance, visual art, I was in all the galleries and things. At Met, MoMA, Whitney, I mean, it's really incredible. Jazz at Lincoln Center, it's all these art influences, right, that are coming in. And I'm studying at Parsons, and Parsons is a really cool school. I studied fashion design, and it's very, very hands-on. So you're constructing things, you're making things, you're learning how to make patterns, but then it also gives you some incredible art background. Like I remember taking color theory, and we're not just reading Eaton or something or Albers. We're like, okay, we're going to mix paints, and this is like with how the color wheel works, And my prof actually for color theory, she and I are now friends, and she'll be one of the people like critiquing my work and talking to me about the work and things. And the other thing about Parsons is it's very much about design thinking. And it's about following an idea. So when you're designing garments, I think a lot of times people think, oh, like pink shirt, that's so cute or whatever. Parsons was really about like, how do you explore sculpture for the body? How do you take an idea and turn it into something else, turn it into art, turn it into a garment? And so this collection down here was one of the portfolio collections that I put together. And the idea, I was doing a collection on America, and instead of putting like, stars and stripes might be the first thing that comes to mind, I was thinking of how a weaving works and how warp and weft work, like some of our legal documents. And maybe that was, the legal background. But then also, how could I take something like the process of flag folding, like the way you fold a traditional flag, and incorporate it into a garment? So you get a skirt, in essence, that goes like that. And I think that's how you get at things that are original. You don't necessarily come at them direct, but you're exploring something else, and you figure out how to pull it into what you're doing. And you end up somewhere different, I think.
This whole idea about trying to get an idea into a garment, I think, was very revolutionary. And
I think the great designers do it, though. Like the great fashion designers of our time, that's what they do. They're picking up on culture, they're picking up on things in the water, they're following different ideas and interests and turning them into clothing. Not just, like I said, oh, it's a cute little shirt or whatever,
So
it's really about ideas.
Fashion's too important to be left to the fashionistas. I think we always used to say that. So take us to March of 2020. The world changed.
Yeah.
For you, for everyone. That's the pandemic. And I think that's probably where ATSP first started, maybe pre-ATSP. So run us through a little bit of that story, and especially that aha moment.
So I was working on a tailoring line at the time, and I was really intent on making sure that I knew how all the garments worked. So I wanted to make all the patterns for them. I wanted to do the samples. And I finally got to the point right before this time where it was time to start meeting with factories and figure out how was I going to get these things made? Where was I going to source the fabric from? And so I had all these meetings set up, and it was the weirdest time because the meetings went from, okay, I'll see you in 2 weeks, which I can't remember if it was 30 or 60 days.
15 days to stop the
What was
spread.
it? To stop, yeah. So then it was, and
45 days.
it kept extending. And so I remember emailing, well, I guess I'll see you in a few months. And these were very physical meetings that I needed to have. We needed to talk through patterns and how this whole process was going to work. And they kept getting put on hold. And it turned into a really weird time because I realized because I couldn't do the things that I was supposed to do right then, I could do anything I wanted to do. And the thing that made me the happiest was starting to explore these art ideas. And so it started on these note cards, basically. And I started doing different collages. Some of them had yarn, some of them started to add color, some of them were sketches. It was just this variety of things. And there's tons of these note cards. I don't know that I don't think I'd call them art objects yet, but I think I'm exploring different art ideas. And then the last thing I'll say about that era is, I don't think I had even realized to that point just how much the museums and the galleries and being in spaces with art mattered to me. And when something's taken away from you, all of a sudden, I think it's when you actually realize, oh shoot, that really matters to me. And I think that's why I started to kind of create that for myself, in part to want to be in dialogue with some of those artists who had really made a home for me.
So you start ATSP. What do you think? Tell us kind of what it's about and your starting point.
So ATSP, it came out, there was a lot of different things that I was thinking about. And we can talk about that later if that's interesting for people. But through a series of things, some of it through the fashion design place and some of it through the art place, I thought that there was something that I could get out of starting to study weave structures. And I was thinking a lot about the canvas, this signature part of art history. When you think of painting, right, you think of painters on a canvas, which is a woven textile, applying pigment. And I thought, well, what if I can build that canvas? So I'm starting to realize that I need to learn how to weave. And to do that, I start basically making more functional items. So I'm making towels, I'm making blankets, things like this. And there's actually a piece here. If you look at that, I know it's kind of hard in this photo, but that second piece in the first photo, that actually turns into this piece. At first, I'm thinking it's going to be a blanket. And somehow I'm going to connect these two weavings. And it's really about exploring gradation, and it's about scale. And I realized that that's not art yet, but it was doing something different. Right. And I started thinking, okay, what can I do with that? And that's really the starting point for this whole body of work that develops, and it's called At the Still Point.
But that up against when you put it up against the wall, there was something magical there because you realized that it stood up to like Nice or...
So yeah, so we were actually, so this is in my studio in New York, one of my studios in New York. And when I put it up, it did something different. And I thought that was really interesting. And I really wanted to understand, how does something go from a weaving, a textile, something that's exploring weave structure, into an actual art object? And the whole process of At the Still Point was thinking through that. From that studio, we brought it into our living room. And Renè actually helped me like suspend it so I could kind of look at it and start taking photos of it. And I thought, oh no, this is doing something different. And we had some incredible furniture, like pieces from like Mies and Corbusier, really beautiful design objects. And for whatever reason, when that piece was in there, it was holding its own. And I thought, oh shoot, okay, we have something. And so that's really where At the Still Point started. And then this doesn't turn into what you see there until several years later as I'm working through all this other work.
So we'll talk about that a little bit, but going from the vertical to the horizontal and grace and one very savage object to a very beautiful object is the process. So, okay, we're gonna start with the works that are in here.
Well, first, actually, let me do something real quick, because I think it's important, since I think most of you guys, at least half, have seen the first show that was at TXRX Labs. But for those of you that haven't, I want to give you just a little background. So, At the Still Point is basically 70 pieces of work. And when I came to Houston, I was trying to figure out how to put them out into the world. And what ends up happening then is that I have two different exhibitions, 3 parts. The first 2 parts, the first exhibition, is out at TXRX Labs, and I'm displaying some of the work there and really installing it to try to figure out how to expand the ideas that are in the work itself. So this is what was out at TXRX Labs. And here's another couple photos from Paul Hester. And then part 2, we can talk about this if people are interested, or I can move on. But there was a problem that happened in the space that I had to resolve. And it was a problem with a cat, actually. And weaving and cats don't go together. So this piece that was kind of the anchor piece, Grace, of that show that really made it work on these axes and have a relationship to weaving, it had to go in and out of the space. And it made me a little sad, but I figured instead of trying to show more work in there, for part 2, I really wanted to figure out, how do I resolve this issue? And so I ended up bringing in a plexi blocks and figuring it out, and then making the part 2 that was in here more about how do I activate the space. Can I do it through dance? Can I do it through connections to poetry? What would that maybe look like? And then part 3 is what you're in right now. So this is the second exhibition that's here at Ion District Garage. And all that work together basically is At the Still Point.
So you have to start with 40,
okay.
And this guy right here, and maybe you can tell them when you designed it, how you put everything on the floor.
So starting point for everything that you see on the walls here is a piece called 40. And it started with one weaving, and it's this weaving that you see in the corner. And it really was about movement and color. And I was thinking of pieces like Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie. Hello, hello, come on in. I was thinking of Judd's piece, Untitled. This was in, I think, his last retrospective. And all these pieces are really about movement. And they're getting your eye to move. Sometimes you feel like they move, even though you know they're still. There's something really interesting about that idea to me. And at the time, I was experimenting with a weave structure called turn twill. And it's one in which you have these diagonal lines that can go back and forth, and you can get them literally to rotate. And so they had a real relationship to movement for me. And so I thought, okay, so Mondrian is doing it with color and with shape, right? So I'm like, Judd, I think that's the color is doing so much of the work in that piece, right? And getting your eye to move. Well, I can add color, but since I can build my canvas, I can also add structure to it. And so that's what I'm thinking with this piece. And that's really where it starts. But then I ask the question, this is a question I always ask with my work, what is doing the work? Is it actually the weave structure or is it really the color? And so that's how one piece, or what I thought was one piece, turns into this huge series of pieces where I'm like asking, is your eye still moving or is it moving in a different way? How can I get it to move in a different way? What would these different weave structures do? So it turns into that kind of thinking. And I end up through this series of processes really, and this series of questions, starting to think more about how textiles relate to art and art history. So for example, how would you make a weaving that relates to drawing? Well, I think, well, drawing is really about line, right? So maybe I can use all these different weave structures to get different lines. And maybe there's a relationship between weaving and drawing.
So those gray ones are maybe about drawing?
I think so. But then I look at something, like this series that developed, and I think this really hits home that point about the canvas as a woven textile. And everything that you're getting in terms of color, structure, light, shading is from the structure, not from the color, right? So I'm not cheating or using only color. It's like, how do I bring these other dimensions and how do I push like the art conversation forward?
This is 40 is your hardest work to understand, or at least for you to has been the hardest to render or articulate to others. Why do you think that is?
40 has been a tricky one for me. I think in part because they're so deceptively simple. You look at them and you think, okay, I've seen a weaving on stretchers or on strainers or some kind of wood before, and I've seen weaving, and a lot of people call them weavings even. But for me, they're really thinking about these boundaries between different art mediums. They're thinking about what is a painting really? What is it about? When does something go from 2D to 3D into something more sculptural? What is a drawing about? What is installation about? And it's really about using these weave structures to think about those different things. And to also think about how textiles relates to art and art history itself. We've had a really interesting relationship recently I think when pandemic first hit, I wasn't seeing that many textile shows. Now, I think especially the last couple of years, I'm seeing a ton of textile shows, right? And I think we're really starting to think about what are all these relationships. And sometimes these things also go in waves. There was movements, back in the 60s and 70s where we're seeing a lot of like fiber stuff as I look back. I wasn't alive then. But yeah, you'll see that. And so I think this is another moment, and I'm hoping that I add something to the conversation about how do we think about that? And when does something that, is a weaving or is a plane, when does it turn into something more sculptural? And what is that? What are those relationships?
So speaking of the planes, so let's go to 5 basics. So they're suspended, and your work is very much about suspension, but tell us why 5 basics is suspended and why you decided to suspend them. And I will tell you that those works, I have this little joke that they were almost aborted because she was fighting with those gals very strongly for a while.
Yeah. These 5 pieces that you see hanging here that form one work, they're called 5 basic positions. And going back to my background, they come out of the 5 basic positions in ballet. And initially, I was thinking a lot about holes. And I was thinking about how could I incorporate holes into a weaving. And so at first, I'm looking at a weave structure called canvas weave, right? Where you can bring space into a weaving. I'm experimenting with different techniques like cramming and denting, where another way to bring space or close space off in a weaving. And I'm initially thinking of them somehow as having some kind of relationship on the wall, right? So I put them up, and I'm thinking, they don't really want to do that. Like, I'm not sure you can completely see in the photo, but if you imagine those against a wall, they're losing what's actually making them work. And it's really about how the light moves through them, right? And maybe holes between them. And so it's about expanding that idea of holes maybe. And how do I take it into real space, right? And these end up, instead of going against the wall, or instead of being on some kind of stretcher or strainer situation, they end up being suspended. And I think, although it starts somewhere here, it really ends up being more about space and how you move through these. And I think that work for me is going to be a work that I think a lot about and how to push that even further forward. What happens with a textile that's really interesting is as you move through, they kind of move a little bit, And so it ends up, this idea of stillness and movement ends up being experienced in a different way. And I think there's a lot to be done there in thinking about suspension, how we move into, through, and around pieces, and like where that can go.
Is there something about, you know, with 40, they're kind of against the wall, but not really. They're tilting away. And then when you get to 5 basics, they're totally not on the wall. And painting is always something that's very nailed to the wall. So was that part of your trying to get towards sculpture, to Richard Serra and the tilted arcs of into, through, and around?
There was different ways I was thinking about basically the ceiling, the floor, installation, how we see pieces, something magical about the wall, there's something magical about the ceiling, or ceiling, there's something magical about the floor to me. And those relationships, I think artists are constantly thinking about those different relationships. So this piece 40, initially when I was thinking about suspending them from rails, the first time I did the installation, the rails went directly into the ceiling. And so the pieces actually, these wires actually hung down direct from the ceiling, right? And I think that was a different feeling than using the wall a little bit more as a support. And so it's always thinking about that relationship. I think painting has such a relationship to the wall, but I don't think just because something uses the wall as a support in a sense that it's necessarily a painting. So I think part of it is all these questions that I'm asking about, you know, if it's on a wall, does it have to be a painting or can it be something else, you know? And I think most people though will agree after you get into suspension, after you start thinking more about the ceiling, I think that's definitely a sculpture. And those are the kind of questions I'm thinking through. I don't know that I have all the answers, but I think those are the questions that I'm
because a lot of sculpture mostly is about the floor. It sits on the floor.
I think a lot of sculpture uses the floor or gravity as a support. And so I think sometimes when we think of support, we think of sculpture as being something almost without a support, and I don't think that's correct. I think there's something else there. But I think I'm still working through that. And even that piece Grace, I think, is thinking about that.
All right, so these are the 2 works that are in here. We're like halfway
And just to
through.
reiterate, so everything that you see on the walls is that piece called 40, and then those pieces are all, those 5 is 5 basic positions, yeah.
What do you guys think so far? Okay, we won't talk too much longer then. Let's move to the works that were not in here, but that were in the other show. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe start with Autobiography, because 5 basics were like an act of faith because you had to keep on working them, and Autobiography I think has a very similar story.
Yeah, so Autobiography was woven actually on the same warp, so the same yarns that this first piece from 40 was woven on. And I was thinking, and forgive the projector because it's kind of tossing the line a little. So this is Malevich black square, and it looks more like a rectangle, but trust me, it's a square. Autobiography is a square. I was thinking a lot about the history of the square in art. And I was thinking, you know, would a piece like this read differently if it was squares instead of rectangles? It was that very simple thought. And funny enough, it really did. I felt like this piece really wants to go in a series, and I felt like Autobiography wants to be its own thing. And I thought that was really interesting to me. But that's kind of how the work develops. It usually starts with some kind of question, something I'm exploring, and then it kind of goes on its own path.
So you're very known for your monochrome, all black, but you're a really great colorist. And the Autobiography is a great colorist, but I think the other one that's great colors is Patriarchs. Yeah. And for those of you that saw it or didn't see it, but these are always the fan favorites.
I see some people nodding, that makes me so happy. Yeah, so these actually, the colors from these came out of a series of paintings that are in the Met's collection from Lorenzo Monaco. And I basically, when I started to research them, I'd seen these 4 on the top in the Met's collection. And when I researched them, I realized that there might have been a 5th. And so I took the colors, the 2 dominant colors in each of his paintings, and I used that for my warp and my weft in the first 5 of Patriarchs. And then the second I wove as solids. And these pieces were really interesting. Initially, the black, I had read that the pieces actually, the edges were black. And so I wanted to use my edges black, and the idea was that that part was going to go on the stretcher, so it was going to go around the piece. But then when I actually took them off my loom, the black actually was doing something different. And the black was getting me, for those of you that saw it, I hope you agree, maybe you don't. I feel like it was moving almost from 2D to 3D in this really interesting space. that almost made you want to go behind it. And so it made me think of like a painting, in the way Caravaggio uses blacks. There's something that makes you feel like you can go around it. And I found that really interesting. And to kind of sum that up, I think that's kind of how I work. I have an idea, and I really try to listen to the work and let it guide me. So if I see something like this and I'm thinking, okay, the black is the most interesting part, then the next thing for me to do is figure out, okay, how am I going to come up with a construction where I can now use this edge that I was planning on using in a whole different way? And that's how the work really evolves.
Maybe go back to the other photo and talk to them about the stacks and the altar pieces. And the church products, if you like.
The scholars, so first of all, the really interesting thing to me about these paintings in the Met's collection was that I feel like a lot of times when we categorize art, I'm not sure that we categorize it the way artists categorize it. I think a lot of people would say these are religious paintings, but for me, this was color theory in action 600 years ago. When I kept coming back to them, it was because of the colors. And they were so beautifully done. And so to me, I think Monica was really dealing more with color. And that's what I wanted to do with Patriarchs. Scholars don't actually know what those pieces were. I think they probably were some kind of altarpiece. And so when I installed Patriarchs in TXRX, I had this space that went up like 25, 30 feet. I mean, it was really high ceiling. And so I think what ended up happening is they started to feel like this modern day altarpiece. And for people that were in the space, a lot of people actually told me that it felt a little bit like Rothko Chapel, which was fascinating to me because they looked nothing like Rothko Chapel. But the feeling in the space got you almost to like a modern day altar, I think.
So with the stacks that lead you to sign, and in West Texas, they were not stacked like this.
Yeah.
They were horizontal, so tell us a little bit about.
Sign, if you notice that this piece from Sign, it comes off of the first one of Patriarchs. It's that kind of warped structure, like that setup on my loom. And it was about indigo dyeing. I was starting to get into natural dyeing, and I was building all these different indigo vats to build up different shades of blue. And I just really wanted to experiment with it. And so I tied on to a warp that I had on my loom to make this piece. And then I started thinking, okay, where can I take that? I think the piece ends up being something and having some kind of relationship to something like Frank Stella's Marriage of Reason and Squalor because of the proportions between the actual piece and all the supports. But I had envisioned it as a lineup of 4 pieces. When I got it off the loom and I actually started working with the pieces, I thought it was actually became more about the space between the pieces, which makes me think of something like Judd Stacks. It's not only the pieces themselves, but what is happening is something being activated, is space in between being activated. So it becomes not only about an individual work, but how these things work together.
So the second to last piece in ATSP is, I'm going to tell you, these gals are my favorites. They're called At the Still Point. It's unfortunate that they're not in here because they're the most feminine of the works, I say. They hold space for sure. They've got these big 3.5-inch stretchers, but they're also pure luxury. The walnut and the glass and the silk. And there's this line that this other sculptor, Ellen Zimmerman, she talked about Twombly's blackboards, and she said they have their own weather. And these girls up here, they have their own weather. But they're also like very autonomous, like they're totally self-contained, which also makes them very female. So I don't know, but you tell me, like, just a little bit about, because I could talk about those girls for a long time.
So these actually came off the same warp on my loom as these pieces that you see in here, 5 basic positions. And the thinking here was about materiality. And so whereas these pieces in here are linen on linen, several of these are linen on silk. And I wanted to know, would that change how you read them and how you feel about them? And I think it absolutely did. I tried actually hanging these pieces in a similar suspension as these, and it didn't work. It just, they wanted something different. They wanted almost to be set apart. You were saying autonomy, right? I think they wanted their own space, and so I ended up creating a construction for these that was more like a shadow box. And they have museum quality acrylic over them because I think they wanted their own space. And so it's kind of another example of how the work kind of shows me where to go or what I need to build for it or create to take it where it wants to go, not necessarily where I'm
Can you just tell them about the frame?
Oh,
and
so the
marking of time, and how much better and beautiful those frames were versus maybe like these.
That's another thing in the work that just speaks to process. There was some frames so I build out all the work, including like the frames and things. And so people call them frames. I don't know that I would call them frames, but the constructions. And I got better with time. And it was one of those questions I had with, okay, if I'm building a product, then I should probably go back and fix the errors, right? But if I'm really about a process, then if I have this body of work, you actually can see me get better. And it's this way of marking time. Like, you can tell the progression of the work by looking at how good or how quality the craftsmanship is. And I thought that was actually a really interesting thing about it. And then even, to continue on that idea, like, there's something about time that way and the process, but then there are also, I feel like these pieces, there's something about the suspension of time itself in the pieces. And so I think they have a relationship to someone like Linda Benglis, and some of her sculptures that seem like you're just kind of, time almost stands still in a certain, or you're able to capture a moment in a certain kind of way.
So that brings us to the last piece in ATSP, the capstone, Grace, seminal work. Maybe you can also tell them about not just the work, but the story of the 3 boxes. So I'll give you a little backstory on that. Is Ernest Hemingway said that he wrote the last paragraph of Farewell to Arms 39 times because he, quote, just had to get the words right. And tell them about those 3 boxes.
Yeah, Grace was like that. Grace went through, you guys saw her at the beginning, right? And she's this weaving that's hanging somehow, and she ends up on construction that's like a box. But even this, there were all these different iterations for me to figure out basically how to resolve her, how she wanted to exist in the world. And I think, in terms of influences for me, I think someone like Richard Serra, this is his Silence for John Cage down here, I think he's had a huge impact on my life as an artist. I also think someone like Charles Ray has had a huge impact. And so I see elements of their sculptures in Grace, but I think Grace does it in a different, or maybe it takes a slightly different turn on it. So I think with Sarah's piece down here, it's so much about—
Tell them what it's made of.
Weight, that's steel. And Grace is wood and fiber, wool. And there's this lightness to her. And if you've seen her, I think she kind of feels like she's floating a bit. And so I think there's kind of an interesting relationship when I see these 2 pieces. Or something like Ray, I think what's doing the work here for Ray is that space between, this is Huck and Jim, between Jim's hand and Huck's back. There's something about the activation of the space there. And I think it's what's happening at the bottom of Grace. It's that space. It really becomes about that space in between, more than the textile or the box, I think. And so it's funny for me to look at something like this and think how I draw influence from artists that I love, but I think I found a way to create work that's original and that speaks to them, but has its own voice and says its own things.
So on that note, you take so much influence from, I always say, these like big alpha male artists, Richard Serra, Charles Ray, David Smith, right? But I always ask you this because I think it's interesting. My own view is I don't think a male could make any of these works. I think it's impossible. But there's something about the lightness of your wood and fabric versus such the heaviness and weightiness of a Richard Serra that, I don't know, maybe you could articulate a little bit.
He always says that about this feminine masculine thing. I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Suspension of disbelief.
I don't know if it's accurate or not. But I know why you say that, and people have said that before. I think there is a certain lightness to my work. I think it is so much about getting space in and creating space that you want to move through. And I don't know if that's a feminine thing or not, but I definitely think the work has a very human scale to it, I think. In a way that I feel, for example, Sarah, who I really love as an artist, it has such a weight and it has such a monumentality to it. I think mine is so intimate. It's really human scale, And that's why before, I mentioned Linda Benglis, I feel like her sculpture is like that too. It's something that you really want to be in an intimate space with. And I don't know if my work will always be like this. I don't know if some of it is, limitations of a loom and in terms of how wide you make pieces. But I think there's definitely this very physical, bodily, I think, connection that I feel and I think people feel to the work.
So we'll end on a few things about your future work. I think one of the big things for you was actually being able to call yourself a sculptor. And, you know, Sarah, of all people, had this line where his sculpture, One Ton Prop, he wasn't sure if it was a sculpture yet because it was using steel, which no one had ever used that material as for a sculpture. And he said, he walked around it and he said, oh, yep, that's a sculpture. And I think that was the same both for Grace and 5 Basics. So that's not something also that we associate maybe people that do textiles with sculpture. So
yeah, it's been a weird question for me because I've gone through these iterations. I've been putting a catalog together and it's gone through all these different drafts. And sometimes I choose to say sculptor, sometimes I don't. For me, I'm a sculptor. Like, I work with space, I work with movement. The pieces I make are either sculptures or they're sculptural works. So to me, that makes me a sculptor. But I think sometimes it's confusing because I think we think of textiles and we think artist, or we don't think of them in a sculptural way. So I think that's been a process. And sometimes I'll use the word artist because I don't want to confuse people, right? But in terms of what I actually do, I would say I'm a sculptor.
So do you have to use textiles then? Because I've always thought that the textiles are, it could be anything. Like it could be crushed cars or something.
I think it could. I think though, I will say, I think that the more than textile and more than fiber, I think it's really about weaving and this idea of weave structure and this idea of interlacement and what can you do with that and how does that relate to art and art history. So I think it's, I know fiber is a material that I'm using, but I think really the idea that I'm following is weave structure and interlacement.
So what does that mean for this next body of work that you're working on?
So I guess I'll wrap up. The next body of work I'm working on is called Ancestors. And it also, I've been weaving it and working on it since January of 2023. And right now I have about 50 weavings, and we'll see kind of how they end up being constructed, how they come into the world. But I've been exploring monk's belt, overshot, for the weavers in the group, monk's belt, overshot, M's and O's, and just trying to bring more space into weavings, and then to figure out not only to get space into the weavings, but to get space in between spatial relationships and tension, how to do that. And I think that's the direction the work is really going in now. And I think one of the questions I'm really playing more and more with is, can a space be a sculpture? And if so, how or why? When does that happen? You know? And so I think that's where the work is happening. Yeah, work in real space.
So 2 final questions. These will probably be the hardest ones. You know, we have that story in New York about make art be happy.
Okay.
And I remember she told me, you know, I don't even know if I believe that. This is the hardest.
It was a marketing line, by the way, that someone used, and it was make art be happy.
And she said, I don't know if I even believe that. This is the hardest shit that I have ever done.
And
maybe, you know, I think society thinks that, you know, you had this very serious job in the law.
No.
And now you do this hippy-dippy art stuff. But maybe you can talk about actually what is more serious. Is art more serious or is the law more serious?
I don't know which one is more serious. That's a hard question. But I will tell you, I think that this is more challenging than when I was a lawyer. And I think for any artist, if you're serious about what you do and you really care about art, like, I think it becomes a real challenge. And in terms of the phrase make art be happy, it does make me very happy. It's a very fulfilling thing to do. And especially when you see it resolved and you see it kind of take on its own life, that is one of the best feelings in the world. But on that path, it is so challenging. And when things are not working the way you want, exactly, and you can't figure it out, and you're really trying to resolve it, that can be one of the most frustrating things. And I think it's an incredibly demanding thing if you want to do it right and when you do it right. But I think that matters.
So here's the last thing.
Okay.
I always say that you've collected almost every academic accolade that you could probably collect. She made a lot better grades than me at Rice, by the way. An editor at Stanford Law Review, which is kind of like a golden ticket, I always say. And you were never content to just live off of the rents of those tickets. And I always say that you run real risks. And that's why I think everyone admires you and why I admire you. But why do you do that? Why do you run? Why do you run?
So some of
Why do
these-
you run such large
Full
risks in
disclosure,
life?
some of these questions I know and some of these questions I don't know. So thank you for that. But I think it's mainly because it matters. I think that art matters. Like, I really think that pushing the conversation forward matters. I think it's been a home for me, and I think the artists that came before me really put so much work into their work. And my hope is that you might look at their work slightly differently having seen my work. I hope it adds something to the conversation, and I hope that other artists will be able to build on things that I've done and take it even further, you know? And even this, like the idea of filming and stuff is, how do I start to like build a record, you know? Because the artists that I love, they built that for me. So how do I start to do that for those, you know, that will come after? And I think my ultimate hope, I really make the work for me because it's home for me, but I hope that when people come that you find yourself somewhere in it and that you have your own experience with it, really.